The last topic is going to be the rise and fall of the Antichrist, and how this relates to our previous two studies is that the focus I mentioned is that the reason why Satan has been instigating anti-Semitism is to try to organize people, to destroy the Jews, to avoid the second coming. And the last major person Satan will be able to use is the Antichrist, and there he plays a pivotal role in Jewish survival, Jewish destruction. Now, by introduction, what we're going to see developing in the tribulation is a counterfeit trinity. Satan will play the role of the counterfeit father, as he does in Revelation chapter 12. And the Antichrist will play the role of the counterfeit son in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. And the false prophet will play the role of the counterfeit spirit in Revelation 13, verses 11 to the end of the chapter. And we see development of this counterfeit trinity by the different names of the Antichrist. So in the scriptures, he's given 11 different names or titles. So within the context of the Hebrew Bible, he's referred to as the seed of Satan in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He's called the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. He's called the king of fierce countenance in Daniel chapter 8, verse 23. He's called the prince that shall come in Daniel 9:26. He's called the desolator in Daniel 9:27, and the willful king in Daniel 11, verse 36. So the first 6 names are Hebrew names from the Old Testament, all of them from the book of Daniel, except the first name where he's first introduced as the seed of Satan. Moving into the New Testament, he's called the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. In the same verse, he's also called the son of perdition. Now, the most common name we use today is the name Antichrist, but that name appears only once specifically with that name in 1 John chapter 2, verse 22. I may skip one. The lawless one is in 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 8, 2 Thess 2, verse 8, and the Antichrist in 1 John 2, 22. The most common name biblically is the beast. And just one example of several is Revelation 11, verse 7. Here we see the beginnings of the counterfeit, because the true Messiah, the true Son, has a multiplicity of names or titles. Every name and the title tells us something about his person and something about his work. The same thing is true with the counterfeit son. A multiplicity of names and titles, each one says something about his person or something about his role. So now with that background, let's turn to Genesis 3 and deal with the origin of the Antichrist. Now, the true Son has both a supernatural origin in that he is conceived of the Holy Spirit, but he also has a natural origin in that he is the biological son of Miriam or Mary. The same thing is going to be true about the counterfeit son. As to the supernatural origin, it's found in chapter 3, verse 15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, chapter 3 describes the fall of humanity, and so it should be natural that that will also contain the first prophecy about the Messiah, because the Messiah is coming to deal with the problem of human sin. There are different rabbinic elements about this account. There's a story that one day Adam came home from work, and Eve asked him a typical wifely question: "Adam, do you love me?" He said, "Who else?" No one else to love in those days. Another story is that while Cain and Abel were growing up, Adam would take him on these walks to teach him different truths. When he felt they were ready for it, he took him by the Garden of Eden. And they could look over the fence and see how beautiful it was there, lush and green. And Adam says to his two boys, "You see how good it is in there? That's where your mother ate us out of house and home." Those are rabbinic stories. They're not my stories. I don't go along with those things. But notice in verse 15 the mention of two different seeds, the seed of Duman and the seed of Satan. So let's go with the seed of Duman. Because by pointing out that the Messiah will be of the seed of the woman, breaks the normal biblical mold. Because throughout the scriptures, the seed is always traced to the male line and the female line. You have a lot of genealogies throughout the Hebrew Bible. You have two in the New Testament, but it goes to the male line. Women are either not mentioned at all, and here and there where they happen to be mentioned, they're mentioned in passing, not directly relevant to the genealogy. But in contrast to all of the other genealogical accounts, in the case of the Messiah, he'll be reckoned after the seed of the woman. It does not explain why at this point, but for some reason or another, he'll be reckoned after the seed of the woman. And the answer only comes centuries later in the days of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Isaiah 7:14 explains what is meant by Genesis 3:15 in that the Messiah will not have a biological father. He'll be conceived and born of a virgin. All of us here have our humanity both from our biological father, biological mother. In the case of the Messiah, he only has one human source, and that's the mother. And for that reason, he'll be traced after the seed of the woman. So from that we learn the seed of the woman will require a supernatural origin, a supernatural conception. And when you have the same word used in the same verse, you have to understand it the same way, and the Antichrist will be of the seed of Satan. And what Satan is going to do one day is impregnate a woman and produce his seed. He tried to do this earlier, not directly by himself, but he had many of his fallen angels take on human form. Whenever angels appear, they always appear as young men, often mistaken for young men. And they intermarry with human women and producing a new race of beings, which King James referred to as they were giants, but the Hebrew word does not mean giants. A different Hebrew word is used, which is the Nephilim. And subsequent renderings, like this is the American Standard Version, says Nephilim, doesn't say giants, because the word Nephilim doesn't say anything about the size of the progeny, but rather that these were superhuman mentally, in human strength, but not in size. And the goal was to corrupt the seed of the woman so the Messiah cannot come. He came close to succeeding until Noah's flood came, destroyed all humanity, and the Noahic line remained pure of that intermarriage. What's going to happen in the future is he himself will impregnate a woman, and that will be his individual seed, which will be the seed of Satan. That will be his supernatural origin. As to his natural origin, go to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, you have the famous prophecy of the 77ths, or a 490-year period God has decreed over the Jewish people. It goes beyond our point in this study to go through this phrase by phrase, but for those of us involved in Jewish ministries, it's a very important passage to know well, because it's the only passage among all of the prophecies about the first coming that provide a timetable for the first coming. And he points out that the first 483 years have already been fulfilled, being fulfilled at the time of the first coming. Then he points out there'll be a gap of time where three other events are going to occur before the last 7 years begin ticking away. And in this section we read this. This is in verse 26. And after the 60 and 2 7 shall the anointed one be cut off, and shall have nothing. And notice the next phrase. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. It's not the prince that shall come, notice, that will destroy the city and the sanctuary, but the people out of whom he comes will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And historically now, the people responsible for destroying the city and the sanctuary were the Romans. And the prince that shall come, therefore, will come out of the Roman ethnic identity. This does not limit it to be Italian, because what used to be the Roman ethnic identity consisted of about 5 different tribes. The Italians were one, the Etruscans another, there were also 3 other groups. So historically, we know it was the Romans that destroyed the temple and the city in the year 70. And yet Christ will come out of that people. So he'll be not only a Gentile, he'll be specifically a Gentile of Roman nationality, of Roman ethnic identity. So putting the supernatural, natural together, the Antichrist is going to be a Gentile of Roman origin. And this is the one that we'll see a bit later in the outline in verse 27, that makes a firm covenant that will trigger the tribulation. Now, in Daniel chapter 7, he's viewed as being the final ruler of the times of the Gentiles. The final ruler of the times of the Gentiles. And that points to his Gentile identity. Now, look at Daniel 11, verse 37. Daniel 11, verse 37. Some people use this in the King James Version to teach he must be a Jew. And in verse 37 in King James says, read, neither shall regard the God, capital G, small o, small d, of his fathers. However, in the context that begins in verse 36 onward, he keeps drawing a different distinction between the singular word for God and the plural word for God. Consistently, it uses the singular term, but in this phrase, he switches to the plural form. And literally reads as in this version, the ESV and more other versions, he shall not regard the gods, small g-o-d-s, of his fathers, meaning he will not continue worshiping the pagan gods of his ancestors. So rendered accordingly, it doesn't point to his Jewish identity. It points to his Gentile identity, which was already established back in chapter 7. The Antichrist must be of the 4th Gentile empire, which is the Gentile empire. Now others try to give a logical argument for his Jewish identity, that he must be of the tribe of Dan because Dan is missing from Revelation chapter 7. And logic is, the reason Dan is missing is because the Antichrist comes from the tribe of Dan. That's just a logical conclusion. The text does not say, even hint at this. And because so much Revelation is based upon the Hebrew Bible, it would be good to see where else certain tribal names may be missing. And the reason they may be missing, usually there's one tribe missing, they're not always the same tribe, that if you list all of the tribal names, you'll have 13 names, not 12. And while Jacob had only 12 sons, Joseph fathered 2 half-tribes. So the tribe of Ephraim and tribe of Manasseh were the 2 half-tribes of the tribe of Joseph. So to maintain the symmetry of 12, you have to drop a name. So the book of Deuteronomy chapter 33, we list the 12 tribal blessings. He drops the name Simeon. only to maintain the symmetry of 12. Or in Ezekiel chapter 47 and chapter 48 of Ezekiel, it describes the settlement of 12 tribes in the Messianic kingdom. To maintain the symmetry of 12, to maintain the symmetry of 12, he must drop a name. He drops the name of Levi or Levi. Just to maintain the symmetry, puts Levi in a whole different category. And for the same reason that Moses left out Simeon, Ezekiel left out Levi, is the reason why John leaves out Dan, to maintain the symmetry of 12. But Dan does not disappear, and Ezekiel's description of the land in the Messianic kingdom, Dan will be settled as the most northern tribe in the Messianic kingdom. So the whole concept of all that the Bible teaches about the times of the Gentiles and the fourth Gentile empire, the Antichrist is a Gentile as part of the last phase of the fourth Gentile empire. So you have another element of the counterfeit God-man, in that he has both a natural and supernatural origin. Now, as far as how he relates to the start of tribulation, let's go back to chapter 9. And verse 27 says, "And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1:7. The pronoun he goes back to his nearest antecedent. And the nearest antecedent is the prince that shall come. And he uses the definite article the prince, a specific one, because he spoke of him twice before, in chapter 7 and again in chapter 8. And so the tribulation begins with the signing of the 7-year covenant, the 7-year treaty. Now, this presupposes two things will be in place. One is and one is not. What is already in place is that this prophecy required a Jewish state with a Jewish government, where to make covenant like this could be signed, and that's only been true as of 1948. But secondly, this prophecy also requires the Antichrist to be in high political authority. Before the tribulation, with whom a sovereign state like Israel can sign a covenant of this nature, because states do not sign covenants with nobodies. And this is not yet in place. Every time a new president is elected, somebody writes a booklet trying to prove that new president is the Antichrist. I remember a book written about Ronald Reagan because his first name, middle name, and last name all had 6 letters, as if God was enamored with the Latin alphabet. And then, bit by bit, the other people also will nominate it. And when Bush was elected, there was some discussion on it, more so with the first Bush than the second Bush. When George Bush #2 was elected to be president, there was a lot of fear and trepidation in Israel, because the last time the Jews listened to someone by the name of Bush, they got lost in the desert for 40 years. As it turned out, he became the most supportive president up until then. He was very well respected in Israel. There's even a monument to him for his role on behalf of Israel. Now, the next element is the rise of the Antichrist to power. And turn to Daniel chapter 8. Basically, the counterfeit son is going to accept the offer from the counterfeit father that the true son rejected. And in the temptation of the Messiah, Satan says, "I will give you my authority over all these kingdoms if you worship me." And there was the legitimate end, because God wants the Messianic son to rule over the kingdoms of the earth. The means of gaining this authority was by means of his suffering, death, and resurrection, not by means of worshiping Satan. And so the true son was simply rejected that offer, but the counterfeit son is going to accept it. So as far as his character, look at chapter 8, verse 23 to 25. And I'll summarize what these verses are saying. First of all, in verse 23, he'll be able to understand dark sentences. This was the same thing that was said of a true prophet earlier, of Daniel, back in chapter 5. He could understand dark sentences, meaning he could solve riddles and problems, like being able to read the writing on the wall and interpret the writing on the wall. And the counterfeit son is going to have the same supernatural ability, but won't come from the true God, but from the counterfeit father. Furthermore, in verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He'll be very powerful, but the powerful does not originate within himself. It's a power that he receives from his biological father, Satan. In verse 24 also, he will be able to destroy the mighty ones, strong people, but also in verse 24, he'll be able to war against the saints and destroy many of the saints. In verse 25, he'll be characterized by craft and deceit. Now look at chapter 11. In verses 36 to 39, we see other facets of his rise to power. So in verse 36, he's described as a willful king, and the king shall do according to his will. Secondly, in verse 36, he shall be characterized by self-exaltation. And thirdly, in verse 37, he will also exalt himself by self-deification. He ultimately claims to be God. Now, two other things about his character. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 2 Thess chapter 2. And look at verse 8. Then shall be revealed the lawless one. And one of his characteristics shall be characterized by lawlessness. And once he gains world control, lawlessness will become the policy of the government. Then in verse 9, even his coming is according to the working of Satan. The Greek word working is the source of English word energizing. He'll be energized by Satan. And energizing includes world powers and signs and lying wonders. And the same three terms used of the true prophets, used of even of the Messiah, powers, signs, and wonders, are now used of the counterfeit son. Powers, signs, but the wonders are lying wonders. But these signs and wonders come from the source of the counterfeit father and not the source of the true God. So this will be his characteristics, and by these characteristics he will accomplish, first of all, worldwide political authority, and secondly, worldwide religious authority. Let's turn back to Daniel and look at chapter 7. In dealing with the fourth Gentile empire, which undergoes 5 successive stages, here we read of the fourth and then the fifth stage of the fourth Gentile empire. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom shall 10 kings arise. So out of a one-world government of some kind, which is the third stage, in the fourth stage you will divide into 10 kingdoms. And these 10 kingdoms include both East and West. It's not limited to the nations of Europe, but worldwide. So there'll be 10 Gentile nations plus Israel. And that will start before the tribulation starts, It will continue until the midpoint of the tribulation. And then the verse continues, and another shall arise after them. He shall be diverse from the former. He shall put down 3 kings. What's happening in the middle tribulation, the Antichrist will declare war against these 10 kings. In the course of this war, he will kill 3 of them. After killing 3 of them, the others will submit to his authority. And the 3 kings he kills are listed in chapter 11. Verses 40 through 45. Chapter 11, verses 40 through 45. He'll kill the king of the north, the king of the south, and the king of the east. In the context of Daniel, the king of the north is Syria, the king of the south is Egypt, and the king of the east is Mesopotamia. And once he kills those 3 kings, the other 7 will submit to him. And that point is made also in Revelation 17, verses 12, 13, and 17. Revelation 17, verses 12, 13, and 17. So with that conquest and with that submission, he now is the one world political ruler. And once he gains political authority over the whole world, he'll move to his next stage to also have world authority over religion. So now to look at Revelation chapter 17. Revelation 17 describes as the one world religion that will be religious authority for the world in the first half of the tribulation. And that is mystery, Babylon the Great. The 2 satanic mysteries I mentioned earlier, and the first satanic mystery is the rise of the man of sin in 2 Thess 2, and the second satanic mystery is mystery Babylon the Great. And this involves a unification of all world religions, all false denominations, into one world super religion. And this one world super religion will rule the world religiously in the first half of the tribulation, and she will do so with the support of those 10 kings. And the true believers of that day that will not submit to its religious authority will suffer persecution, and many will be martyred. But that will change at the midpoint of the tribulation after gaining world political control. Then he will gain religious control, which involves destroying this one world religion. Look at verse 16 of chapter 17. The 10 horns which you saw, and the beast these shall hate the holy. Well, she received the support of the human governments, but they were not in favor of it. They will hate the harlot, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and shall burn her utterly with fire. And so the first thing he does to destroy religious opposition, he destroys this one world religion. And while chapter 18 deals with a physical Babylon, chapter 17 deals with a spiritual Babylon. The next stage is this war against the 2 witnesses of chapter 11. In chapter 11, verses 3 through 13, 3 through 13, the 2 witnesses are allotted a ministry for 1,260 days. That's 3.5 years. That's the first half of the tribulation. All attempts to kill them will fail, and those who try to kill them are killed themselves. They have supernatural power to cause people to be destroyed by fire when they attack the 2 witnesses. They also can turn water into blood. But once their 3 years have finished and the allotment of ministry has ended, then the Antichrist can do what many others tried to do and failed. Now look at verse 7. And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss shall make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And while the two witnesses will be resurrected, they do not remain on earth with the resurrection after 3.5 days of deadness on the streets of Jerusalem. They'll ascend into heaven. Then that removes a second key opposition to his world religion. And the third thing he will do is in chapter 7, verse 25. Chapter 7, I should say Daniel chapter 7, not Revelation. Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. And verse 25 says, He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. He shall think to change the times and the laws, and they shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half a time. But notice he will target the saints. He will target two groups, the Jews because the power of the second coming is in their hands, and the saints because they know what must happen for the Messiah to return. He doesn't want them to spread that kind of news. Let's move on now to the death and resurrection of the Antichrist, which carries out the counterfeit a bit further. And let's look at Revelation 13. Now, Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 45, Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45, describes a war in which he wars against the 10 kings. In the course of that war, before he's successful in killing 3 of the 10 kings, he himself ends up dying. Now, chapter 13, and skip down to verse 3. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet was the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Now, these 3 animal-like features are the same animal-like features found in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. And so the body of this beast is that of a leopard, which represents the Hellenistic influences on the final empire. His feet were the feet of a bear. The bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and that shows the Medo-Persian influences on the final empire. And then the lion represents the Babylonian Empire. So all 3 previous empires leave some measure of influence on the fourth empire. Now, just as in Matthew 28, the true Father gave his authority to the true Son, and the true Son then sends out the apostles to evangelize the world, notice the development of the counterfeit aspect towards the end of verse 2. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. And the Antichrist accepts this offer. So when verse 3, so in his head as though it had been smitten unto death, but the death stroke was healed, and the whole world wondered after the beast. Now, the term beast can sometimes represent the fourth Gentile empire in its entirety, but sometimes the final leader of the fourth Gentile empire, the Antichrist. Here the focus is on the one of his heads as though it had been smitten unto death. And this is the stage when the Antichrist is the head of the fourth Gentile empire. And because he says smitten as unto death, people assume that he may have been wounded, but he fakes a death and therefore fakes a resurrection. But it's always wise to look how certain terms are used elsewhere, specifically in the same book. So keep your finger here and go back to chapter 5 for a moment. Revelation chapter 5. Describing here the true Son, chapter 5, verse 6. describing here the true Son. I saw in the midst of the throne of the four living creatures, in the midst of the elders, a lamb standing, as though it had been slain. Same phraseology of the true Son. Now that Jesus simply appeared to die, never really died on the cross, the testimonial for Gospels, he died a real death. But then suddenly, he was very much alive because of a resurrection. So the phrase "as though it had been slain" is an idiom for a resurrected individual. He died. By normal human experience, he should remain dead, but suddenly he's very much alive. And the very phrase used of the true Son is now being used of the counterfeit Son, and must be understood in the same way. He really is killed in the war against the 10 kings. But then he'll be resurrected by his counterfeit father, so it's going to be as though he had been slain. And so, in verse 3, he's both killed and resurrected. As a result of that resurrection, in verse 4, the world begins to worship the Antichrist as being God. In verses 5 and 6, he's allowed to continue for 3.5 years. His rule as an absolute worldwide emperor, absolute monarch, is going to last for 3.5 years, but the second half of the tribulation. And in verse 7, he will war against the saints. And in verse 8, the world all over is going to be worshiping him. So now we also have another counterfeit element, the counterfeit death and resurrection of the counterfeit Son. Let's go to the next thing on your outline, which has to do with the abomination of desolation. And we begin with Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. We note already in verse 27, he signs the 7-year covenant that will trigger the tribulation. And they're going to read, in the middle of the 7, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So right in the middle of tribulation, he causes a forced cessation of the temple service, which shows that the third temple, the tribulation temple, will be standing by the middle of the tribulation, and it's been functioning for a while. Exactly when it will be rebuilt, we have two options. It may be rebuilt in the first half of the tribulation, or it may be rebuilt even before the tribulation starts. That's as close as we can come to based upon what the Bible reveals. Either before the tribulation or in the middle of it, or the first half of it, but by the middle it is standing and functioning. And even to the full end, and that determines shall wrath be put upon the desolate. Now, what this tells us that the event called the Abomination of Desolation occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation, the middle of the 7. It doesn't tell us exactly what it is, but the word abomination in Hebrew often refers to something idolatrous. There are other usages of the term, but primarily of something idolatrous. Let's go to chapter 12 and look at verse 11. And from the time that the continual burnt offering shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate be set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now the second half of the tribulation is exactly 1,260 days. But the abomination will have to be continued in the tribulation temple for an additional 30 days beyond the end of the tribulation. Again, says nothing about what exactly it is, but it will continue for 3.5 years. Now the phrase that shall be set up, which is something, usually means something erect, like an image would be erect. Now we go to Matthew chapter 24. And verse 15, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of to Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let him that reads understand, then let them in Judea flee unto the mountains. And the previous person happened to be President Barack. I was often asked, could he be the Antichrist? And my answer was, he might fulfill the prophecy of verse 15 about the Obama nation of desolation, but no, he's not the Antichrist per se. But here the abomination of desolation serves as a sign to the Jews to flee the land. And the present state of Israel will be safely in the land until the midpoint of the tribulation. There'll be a collapse of the government, and there'll be a flight of the Jews fleeing the land, and they'll be exiled, not dispersed throughout the world again, but exiled for 3.5 years. And at the end of the 3.5-year period is when they come to faith that will trigger the second coming. The abomination, exactly what is, it's not stated at this stage. But it will be a sign for the Jews to flee the land, because it inaugurates Satan's final attempt to annihilate the Jews once and for all. That's the trigger. Now let's go Revelation 11. And look at verse 1, Revelation 11, verse 1. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and one said, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein, and the court which is outside the temple, leave without and measure it not. It has been given over to Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. At the midpoint of tribulation, once again, you have a Gentile army overtaking the city, and they'll be able to maintain control for 42 months, which is the second half of the tribulation. It would be under this authority that the abomination of desolation is set up, though it does not specifically state what it is. Now, what it is going to involve two things. The first thing is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thess chapter 2. 2 Thess chapter 2, and look at verse 3. 2 Thess 2 and verse 3. In dealing with the day of the Lord in verse 2, let no man beguile you anywise, for it will not be except the departure come first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, he who opposes and exalts himself against all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. The first stage is that he takes over the temple compound, as in Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2. He will declare his own deity right there in the temple compound and call upon the whole world to worship him as God. That will be the first stage of the abomination of desolation, but he will not remain in Jerusalem. What he will do is move his new capital to the rebuilt city of Babylon, which will become both his political headquarters and the economic world headquarters. He will inaugurate a second stage of the abomination, and for that we go back to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13. In verses 11 through 15, we have the third member of the counterfeit trinity introduced, the false prophet. And notice the extent of this counterfeit. Verse 11, also another beast coming up out of the earth, he had 2 horns, like unto a lamb, and by giving him horns of a lamb, it gives it a religious character. However, unlike the true lamb of chapter 5, but he spoke as a dragon, and so his origin is of the dragon, who's the counterfeit father. And in verse 12, he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his sight. And just as the true spirit is co-equal with the true son, this counterfeit spirit will be co-equal with the counterfeit son. And he makes the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose death stroke was healed. And just as the true spirit draws people to worship the true son, the counterfeit spirit draws people to worship the counterfeit son. Now the true spirit arrived in Acts 2 with miracles, signs, and wonders, and the same thing happens here in the counterfeit system. And in verse 13, he does great signs. They should even make fire come down upon the earth in the sight of men. And he deceived them that dwell on the earth by reason of the signs which was given him to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image of the beast who had the stroke of the sword and lived. And so as part of his signs and wonders, in causing people to be deceived that the counterfeit son is the real God, he now draws people to make an image of the counterfeit son. But what else can he do? In verse 14, it was given to him to give breath to it, even to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as that should not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And so this is the image that's given real life for the ability to kill and to speak. It is this image that will be erected as the abomination in the Jewish temple, the third temple. And so while Babylon is his economic and political capital, Jerusalem remained his religious capital. Now let's go to the next part of the outline dealing with the mark of the beast in verses 16 through 18. The true Spirit came with the true seal, and those of us who believe are sealed by the Holy Spirit into the body of the Messiah, so we can never fall out. The same thing is true of the counterfeit Holy Spirit. He now causes a seal. Let's read what it says, because there's a lot of people that read things into it that is simply not in the text. Verse 16, he causes all the small and the great and the rich and the poor and the free and the bond that there should be given them a mark on their right hand or upon their forehead, that no man should be able to buy or sell save he that had the mark, even the mark of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. He that had understanding, let him count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now those who are willing to accept the Antichrist as God will be given a choice of taking a mark either on their right hand, or for those more zealous, on their forehead. And that number is going to be the same for everyone who chooses to worship the Antichrist as God, 666. It is not a banking system, it's not a credit system, it's not a credit card system. It simply gives a person the right to make a living. Because in a credit system, everybody has to have a different number. Here, everybody gets the same number. A good example is what happened under the Nazi occupation of Poland. And when they captured Poland, all the Polish people had to turn in their ID identification and get a new one. Now, the Gentile ID cards were given with a swastika on it, but the cards given to Jews did not have that. So those with the swastika can continue working and continuing their business and make a living, but the Jews without the swastika had to leave their homes, their apartments, move into the ghetto that would now be sealed by a wall around the ghetto, until the Jews were systematically exterminated. There's a meaning to what he says here. It's not a credit system, a banking system. It simply gives people who take the mark the right to maintain a living. And it gives 5 clues. For example, in verse 17, it is the name of the beast. Secondly, is the number of his name. In verse 18, thirdly, it's the number of the beast. Fourthly, the number of a man. And fifthly, the number 666. What he's dealing with is that the numerical value of his name in Hebrew alphabet will equal 666. In classical Hebrew, we didn't have a separate system for letters and numbers. In modern Hebrew, they have this, but not in biblical Hebrew. So every letter was also a number. So every letter had a numerical value. Every word in Hebrew would have a numerical value. Every name in Hebrew letters would have a numerical value. And there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The first 10 go in sequences of ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then skips by tens to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Then by hundreds to 200, 300, 400. So I can take anybody's name and put in the Hebrew letters and give you the numerical value of your name. She wanted to see if you're a possible candidate for this office, being the Antichrist. Just see me afterwards, and I'll give you the numerical value of your name. But that is the meaning. Now, you cannot figure out in advance because, for example, take the number 6. 1 and 6 equals, 1 and 5 equals 6, so this 5 is 1, but be different letters in different order. 2 and 4 and 2 equals 6, and that requires different letters in a different order. There's no way to determine what his actual name is until a name appears that fits many other aspects and descriptions we found in the scriptures. And if somebody knows how to put their name in Hebrew lettering, we can tell whether it is 666 or not 666. And so this will be the counterfeit seal of the Holy Spirit, of the counterfeit spirit. Now skip over to chapter 14. Here in chapter 14, we see the taking of the mark is going to be the point of no return. Verse 9, chapter 14, verse 9. Another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a great voice, if any man worships the beast and his image, and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he also shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is prepared unmixed in the cup of his anger. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. And they have no rest day and night that worship the beast and his image, and who receives the mark of his name. Once a person chooses to take the mark, he has forfeited any opportunity to be saved. He's now faced with two things. First of all, the outpouring of the wrath of God, which will be the 7 bowl judgments coming up in chapters 15 and 16. And then secondly, he'll suffer the eternal torment of the lake of fire. But nobody will take the mark out of ignorance, because everybody in the world will have heard the gospel at least twice, if not more, before they have to make this decision. The first opportunity is by means of the 144,000 Jews in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 through 8, chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. And the second time is when the angel in chapter 14 preaches the eternal gospel. As in verse 6, I saw an angel flying in mid-heaven, having eternal good tidings to proclaim unto them that dwell on the earth. And So everybody in their own language will hear an angel giving them the message of the gospel, what they need to believe to be saved. So those who reject this message that they received at least twice or more, they will now then take the mark. They have forfeited any opportunity to be saved. You'll have some people sometimes will teach if you heard the gospel before the rapture, you cannot be saved afterward, but that's nowhere in Scripture. Rather, you can be saved after the rapture as well, but once the mark is taken, you no longer have the opportunity to be saved. Now, concerning the next part of the outline, the revelation of the Antichrist, I'm not going to detail this because that's going to take a bit of time. This is what it teaches, that there'll be two different revelations of who the Antichrist is just before the tribulation or in the tribulation. The first revelation is in chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. Just before the tribulation starts, believers living at that point of time, they may be church saints, they may be post-rapture saints. Believers at that point of time will know who the Antichrist is. They might know it by the numerical value of his name, or they might know it by the announcement of a soon impending of the signing of a 7-year covenant with Israel. But just before the tribulation, believers will know who the Antichrist is. The second revelation in chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, will come in the middle of the tribulation, as he takes over the temple and commits the first stage of the abomination of desolation. Then his true character will be revealed to the Jewish population. And they'll recognize that the abomination is a signal he's not their friend but their enemy. And that's what will cause them to flee the land in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. Okay, let's conclude with the fall of the Antichrist. Key passages, Revelation chapter 16, verses 12 to 16. This describes the beginning of the campaign of Armageddon, when he gathers all the armies of all the nations against the Jewish people. By that point of time, about 2/3 of the world Jewish population has suffered persecution and death, but 1/3 is still living, and the goal is to annihilate this 1/3 group still living. However, during the campaign of Armageddon, Israel will finally come to a national faith and salvation that will result in the second coming. And the first casualty of the second coming will be the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. 2 Thess 2, verse 8. Isaiah chapter 4, verses 4 through 14. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 4 through 11. Shows what happens after the Antichrist is killed and his soul enters into hell. As his soul enters into hell, people, those already in hell, will rise in astonishment that he also suffered the same demise as they have suffered. And then Isaiah chapter 14, verses 16 to 21. Isaiah 14, 16 to 21. He points out the body of the Antichrist will not be buried. It lies exposed, being trampled upon by his own soldiers. The body lies exposed, trampled, and unburied. Now, why does the body remain unburied? Let's look at Revelation 19. Verse 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat upon the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought the signs in his sight, wherewith he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast and them that worshipped his image, that they too were cast alive into lake of fire that burns with brimstone. So the first ones to be cast into lake of fire, which according to Matthew 25 was originally prepared for the devil and his angels, the first humans to fall into this place will be the counterfeit son and the counterfeit spirit. They'll have this lake all to themselves for the first 1,000 years of its habitation. Nobody will join them until after the end of the Messianic kingdom. He continues following the element of the counterfeit son, but it's one step beyond what he intended. Because after he is killed, he's resurrected now for the second time by the Messiah. He becomes the first fruits of the second resurrection. The resurrection of the true Messiah, the true Son, was the first fruits of the first resurrection, which covers all believers resurrected for eternity, and there are 5 stages of first resurrection. There'll be 2 stages of second resurrection. He'll be the first one resurrected, therefore the first fruits of the second resurrection, and then he'll be joined by all the other unbelievers 1,000 years later. And so he placed all the counterfeit son 1 point beyond what he wished to play. So that'll become the final demise of the counterfeit son. And that will be through the second coming, as will salvation, the reestablishment of the Messianic kingdom, and finally the world can enjoy a demon-free world, and the Jews can enjoy the land in its entirety for the first time, and live in prosperity and live in peace. Selah. There's 2 other times I'll be nearby on this itinerary. One is in Gloucester, which will be on Thursday, October 31, and also one in Marlow on Friday, November 1st. I will conclude this whole itinerary. In between, I'll be much further away than in this area, but that's 2 other locations you can think about. We'll have the 5-minute break, and then we'll have the questions.